Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar on anti-capitalism. We're going to get started in a few minutes. I'm going to give folks a chance to get on, but just wanted to remind everyone who's on right now to please go on mute once your audio connects. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started. First, I just want to thank everyone for spending your Tuesday evening with us. My name is Kimberly Gonzalez, and I am the Operations Director at Law for Black Lives. This is the Law for Black Lives and Liberation Road webinar on anti-capitalism, and we're super excited for the conversation tonight. This is the last installment in our winter webinar series around foundational politics. This is the third webinar, which joins the other two around Black queer feminism and abolition. For us, the idea was to ground folks in what we see as foundational politics that both drive our movement and our movement lawyering practice. We're super excited to dig into anti-capitalism tonight and hear about work in the field that moves from that lens from our panel. Law for Black Lives is a network of around 4,000 lawyers and legal workers across the country committed to building the power and scope of Black liberation movements. Our main goals are to work with partners and organizers on the ground to transform the legal field, support base-building organizations that are Black-led, and transform the law. We're honored today to be hosting or co-hosting this webinar with one of the leading organizations across the country that work or do work around anti-capitalism, Liberation Road. We're joined today by one of their national staff members, Whitney Maxey. Whitney is a Southern Black queer woman that currently works, as I said, as the national or part of the National Staff for Liberation Road. She's been working at the intersections of race, class, and gender for almost 10 years through a variety of issues that include housing, immigration, anti-state violence, and electoral work. I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Whitney, to introduce everyone to Liberation Road.
Thanks, Kim. Liberation Road is about a 35-year-old socialist organization that's based here in the United States. And we are a cadre organization, which for us means striving towards having a highly disciplined and politically aligned core of organizers that are our members. That carry out collective organizing work together through the guidance of a national strategy. Most of our membership are based in the South, one time for the Southerners. I think that's about it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Whitney. We're really excited to be joined by four incredible speakers tonight. Betty Hung is a longtime social justice advocate with a focus on law and organizing. For over 20 years, Betty has worked on campaigns and initiatives in the areas of worker rights, racial justice, immigrant rights, education equity, and gender justice. Betty has played an integral role in campaigns that have achieved victories, including winning $22 million in additional annual income for Los Angeles taxi workers enacting landmark state legislation allocating $240 million to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Cade University of California graduation pipeline. Vero Powell is a 2017 Skadden Fellow and Associate Counsel with the Criminal Justice Project. His 2-year fellowship incorporates multiple modes of advocacy and strategic collaboration to challenge indigent incarceration in Baltimore, Maryland. His work includes the direct representation of low-income debtors sued by bail bond companies in debt collections actions and of individuals unable to pay traffic fines and fees. Together with other local advocates, he also uses impact litigation and policy interventions to end money bail in the criminal justice system in Maryland. Bill Fletcher has been an activist since his teen years. Upon graduating from college, he went to work as a welder in a shipyard, thereby entering the labor movement. Over the years, he's been active in workplace and community struggles, as well as electoral campaigns. He's worked for several labor unions in addition to serving as a senior staff person in the National AFL-CIO. And our last speaker, but certainly not least, is Whitney, who we've already introduced. So tonight's conversation is going to start with a dive led by Bill into racialized capitalism and what we mean when we say anti-capitalism. Whitney will then walk us through a short poll exercise, and then we'll jump into the panel to close out the night. So before I hand it over to Bill, I wanted to give everyone on the call 3 minutes to reflect on what the term anti-capitalism means for you. And I'd like to invite everyone to share your reflections in the chat box if you feel comfortable. And hopefully Bill will be addressing some of those thoughts in his presentation tonight. So we're going to go ahead and take those 3 minutes to reflect, and then we'll pass it on to you, Bill. Okay, great. Thank you all for engaging with that. I just also want to say, if you have any thoughts or any questions that you want to get answered today, we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. So just go ahead and drop those in the chat box and we'll come back to them. And with that, Bill, I will pass it to you to take us away.
Okay, thank you. And good evening to everyone. I have the unenviable task of, in 8 minutes, trying to explain racialized capitalism. I conveyed to Whitney that she owes me a bottle of Jack Daniels for doing this. So in any case, let me start with, first of all, what is capitalism? So it's a very strange system that is focused on the accumulation of wealth for private control. And I distinguish private from individual. If I have time, I'll explain that. through the extraction of what's called surplus value from the workers who produce. So what that means in effect is that when workers produce things, the capitalist is able to pay the worker less than the actual value, overall value of the product or service that they are producing. And that surplus that results is what's called surplus value. And that is built into the system. And that's really important to understand because it relates to a second point, which is that capitalism is an amoral system. Now, you can argue whether it's immoral, which I think it is, but more importantly, it's amoral. It's a system without any morals. It is driven by the ultimate desire to achieve further and further profits through this extraction of surplus value and gaining control of other wealth. Now, the noted and late economist John Kenneth Galbraith once said that the word capitalism is often opposed by many mainstream economists because when you say capitalism, you're actually saying who is in control. And I've always thought that that was very profound. The mainstream economists talk about free market economies, competitive economies, and all of that is basically bogus. The system itself is capitalism, and it's the definition of this is the ultimate control of capital. It's a system that developed over hundreds of years, going back to what was called mercantile capitalism. Sometimes it was referred to as primitive accumulation, and others have called it war capitalism. And basically what that was that when capitalism was first getting started in more or less the 1300s and 1400s, in order to actually kickstart the system, it had to be built on the basis of theft. And that theft took many different forms. It took the form of what are called land enclosures, as you saw, where the peasants were being driven off of the land in order for the land to be obtained by a smaller number of people to use for their own ends. It was done, the theft included invasions, like the invasion of Ireland or the invasion of the Western Hemisphere, and the raping of those territories. For example, in the Western Hemisphere, one of the points that Marx makes is that capitalism would have gone nowhere without the invasion of the Western Hemisphere and the gold and silver that was stolen from the land and from the people and sent to Europe, upon which the capitalist system was really able to jumpstart. Or the theft could be the theft of human beings. So the forced labor from Africa, which in the beginning included both slaves and indentured servants, and then ultimately it was racial slavery for life, which became a means for this system to grow, to get started to grow, and to gain the traction that it did. There are several books that I want to just mention. One is Empire of Cotton by Sven Burkett, which is an incredible book about the centrality of the cotton industry and the development of capitalism. A second is The Many-Headed Hydra by a guy named Linebaugh, that looks at the origins of capitalism in the North Atlantic, both in Europe and North America. And a third is Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. Now, there are differences between each of these, but there's an immense that folks can learn from this. So the second big chunk of what I wanted to say is that race is intertwined with the construction of capitalism. This is critical for us to appreciate. It's not like race was an add-on, to some pure economic system, sort of like Plato put onto something. Race was integral to the way the capitalism was constructed. So when the British, for example, colonized Ireland, the key to the colonization was the creation of the notion of race. That is, that the indigenous people of Ireland were considered an inferior race. This wasn't on the basis of a color line, but the British were very serious that the indigenous Irish were an inferior race as far as they were concerned. And thus, in Northern Ireland today and in Britain, people will use terms like anti-Irish racism, which for those of us of color in the United States sounds like a contradiction in terms. But when you're actually over there, you understand exactly what is meant by that. The invasion of the Western Hemisphere and the accumulation of gold and silver, as I mentioned, was critical in terms of the development of a whole series of industries, everything from banking to shipping, etc. All of this was important, and for the resources to go into the development of the cotton industry. And so the justification for this exploitation was found in this notion of the indigenous in the Western Hemisphere being somehow inferior, and that the Europeans were colonizing and civilizing, when obviously that's not what they were doing. So then you add on to that the introduction of Africans. And the introduction of Africans as both a forced labor population, but then the evolution of the African reality in North America, and well, actually in Americas, of moving from being in North America at least indentured servants to being slaves for life. And this goes to the second piece of race, and capitalism, that the capitalist system needed a method of social control. That what capitalism as a system generates competition, not simply among capitalists, but competition among the workforce. And the competition is one of people competing for what is left over after the capitalists have grabbed it. That competition can play itself in a number of different ways, but one of the most effective ways has been the introduction of race, which has been used by capitalists as this method of social control, and to get within a certain population, and specifically in the Western Hemisphere, the European so-called white population, an identification between them, the working people among the Europeans, and the rich. And metaphorically, I describe it as a uniform, that whites were given this racial uniform. And the racial uniform was actually imposed upon them. There was, believe it or not, in the 1600s in North America, significant resistance to this, but it was imposed upon them, but as a condition of becoming white, that meant that they had to embark on and agree to align themselves in the oppression of the indigenous, the oppression of the African, and the oppression of subsequent groups like Mexicans and Asians. All of that guaranteeing that no matter how poor a white person might happen to be, insofar as they were accepted as white, they were guaranteed they could never become slaves. They weren't guaranteed anything else, but they were guaranteed that. And that mechanism led to an identification of interests, which helped to break apart various acts of solidarity among working people. Let me say two other final points before I run out of time. One is that in Latin America, the development of white supremacy and capitalism played itself out differently than in North America, in large part because in Latin America, you did not have the mass migration of people from Spain and Portugal. You had conquerors that went in and certain settlers, but they went in to basically rape the land and the people. And through that, and through the importation of Africans, they started to create over time these different, what they identified as racial categories. And the Spanish had a name for it. It was called las castas, the castes. And this became an incredibly effective mechanism for controlling the people at the bottom. Because basically what it said was that the closer you became to white, the higher up the racial pyramid you went. And thus in families and communities, the distinction based on shades of color becomes very, very important in terms of dividing people up. Thus, you have circumstances like the Dominican Republic, right next door to Haiti, with African blood flowing through the veins of virtually every Dominican, but within the Dominican population, immense hatred of Haitians and of African blood, and this deep, deep desire to identify as something else, anything but as an African. And we can see where that left us. And the final point is that anti-capitalism is not always progressive. There are anti-capitalist movements that are actually quite reactionary, movements that are calling for monarchies, for neo-feudalism, things like that. And so it's not just about being anti-capitalist, it's about what we're in favor of. And I would argue, as a longtime socialist and Marxist, that what we should be fighting for is a socialist transformation of this country and of this planet. That's it.
Well, Bill, you earned that bottle of Jack Daniels, I tell you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I just wanted to say one note about our name that I forgot to mention. So we are now known as Liberation Road, but we're formerly Freedom Road Socialist Organization, which may ring some bells for a couple of people. So now I'm going to take us through the spectrum exercise that we have laid out. And part of what we just want to be able to do is to really see where people land on kind of different anti-capitalist concepts. And the way it'll work is okay, apparently there's a poll right in my face. There's a poll that pops up in your face. And once I read a statement, you will select one of the options that are given. So we'll give y'all, a few seconds to do that. And then I'll ask, just for one or two people from different parts of the spectrum to say why you may have strongly disagreed with the statement, or why you might be neutral, or why you might have somewhat agreed. And then we'll move on to the next statement, totaling 3 statements. Okay, so just to give some context for the first statement. So, part of what Bill was, or part of thinking about what it means to be anti-capitalist is really thinking about new relationships of various things, right? So it's new relationships of, what it means to be the employer or the employed, new relationships around, who owns and controls the means of production, that type of stuff. So this first statement uses an example of a current worker cooperative model that operates in a way that's counter to, in many ways, kind of capitalist business models. And so the poll question is, I don't know where it is, but it reads, I believe worker cooperatives like Mondragon in Spain are good models for how workers can have active and central roles and responsibilities in business operations, for example, production decisions, and fairly distributing profits generated from the workers. The example being the CEOs can make no more than 8 times the lowest paid employee. So on the poll, you will select strongly agree, or any of the options that speak to how you feel about that statement, how you feel about Mondragon from what I presented, if you've never heard of Mondragon. And then I'll take a couple of responses. right, so you have 2 more minutes to respond. So you can think nice and deeply, maybe even do a quick Google search of Mondragon, be like, what the fuck is this woman talking about? And then we'll take some responses. All right. So for this first statement about Mondragon, can I take the person that somewhat disagreed? And just try to keep your response to no more than 1.5 minutes. Or can I take someone that agreed?
Hi, this is Professor Randall. I have this thing. It puts up vanilla, but I don't like to be called by my first name. You can call me Ms. Randall if you prefer. The thing that I am concerned about is the anti-racism part of it. I know about the model, and in Dayton, they've been doing some work on developing some groceries alternative around the model in Cincinnati. But I'm still I don't know enough about it to be able to say that it really would be capable of being anti-racist, and especially in a diverse society that has racism embedded into its soul. So that would be my concern.
Thank you, Ms. Randall. Can we take one more speaker that selected somewhere on the spectrum of agree?
This is Karen, and I think models like that are really, really wonderful. My concern is, how do you build out something like that on a national scale?
Okay. Yeah, we actually have time then to take one more comment.
I'll also throw in my 2 cents. From what I understand of Mondragon, I haven't studied it a lot, but it's an imperfect model. The reason why I guess the national state, the capitalist state, has tolerated it is because it's explicitly rejected class struggle. And as it's increased it, so on the one hand, it's been good because the worker cooperator owners have been shielded from larger economic crises and from the layoff trends that accompany that. But on the other hand, as this model expands, few of its foreign workers are brought into ownership. And from what I understand, as employees, they have very critical experiences with management, as well as I also hear that pollution is a big concern because that model has not addressed it. So those are just my 2 cents.
Great, thank you for that background. So let's move on to the second question. So one, I do want to say like what people are putting out. My role in this moment isn't to try to respond. It is just to hear where y'all are at around what we're presenting. So then the second statement is, I believe race and gender should be centered in ways that ensure economic and social equality for all, especially the needs and experiences of Black people. No one disagreed. So can we hear from 2 people around why you agreed with that statement or what that statement means for you? And again, just try to keep your comments to 1.5 minutes. Ray, if you're talking, we can't hear you. Still can't hear you, Ray. If you don't want to speak out for whatever reason, you can also put your explanation of why you agree with the statement or disagree with a particular statement in the chat. So there are a couple ways to engage. Ray, that would include you since we can't hear your audio. If you could put your comment in the chat, that would be helpful. All right, let's move on to the third statement. If no one has anything they want to say around the previous one. I forgot to give the context. So as Bill was stating in his presentation, economic systems don't exist in a vacuum. And so, social systems become central to kind of capital accumulation, and propping up engineered economic and social hierarchies. And so that statement was speaking to like a reimagining around what that could look like, given that that's a fact. So then the third statement is looking to address a kind of a key part of being anti-capitalist, and again, wanting to look forward to, like, if you're against something, what does that mean you're for? But so anyways, because a part of being anti-capitalist are building alternative, alternative institutions. This last statement is addressing alternatives that have been being pursued by various sectors of the housing movement today. So the statement is, I believe that community land trusts are a good model for how residents can own and control most aspects of their housing needs in their neighborhoods. And if it's helpful, I'll just say a little bit about what community land trusts are. It's literally just going to be like a sentence. But they are entities that help kind of develop and steward like affordable housing and various other kind of community and commercial spaces like community gardens or civic buildings or community assets, all in service to the people that live in the community and therefore have deep ties and deep stakes to that community. And so again, we'll just take one or two responses for why someone chose disagree or somewhere on the spectrum of disagree, and take one statement from someone that chose on the spectrum of agree. And folks can look to the chat. Someone just put in a response about a response to statement number 2. So can we get one brave soul that's willing to speak out and say why they either agreed or disagreed? All right, well then with that, I will pass it back to Kim. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Whitney, for walking us through that. So it's time to jump into our panel. And Betty, I wanted to start with you. Could you talk to us a bit about your understanding of anti-capitalism and about the work that you do and how it ties into that? You're on mute, Betty. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So I'm Betty Hung, and I work here at the UCLA Labor Center. I really want to just thank Law for Black Lives for inviting me to join this webinar tonight. So in response to Kimberly's question, so I actually started off my legal career over 20 years ago when I was freshly minted out of law school, working on the El Monte Thai and actually Latinx garment worker case. So this was a case, probably the first major trafficking case in the United States, where Thai workers were actually enslaved literally behind barbed wire at an apartment complex in El Monte, sewing garments for some of the nation's leading manufacturers and retailers, you know, under armed guard. And when a couple of the workers escaped and alerted the authorities, the workers were then released, although they were then, the government tried to deport them. And what happened is they came together with Latinx workers who had been working at a front shop, and together they actually filed a lawsuit against the manufacturers and retailers who they've been sewing for, and really to reclaim their dignity and justice, and they won millions of dollars in unpaid wages. And so I share that example because I think when we talk about kind of racialized capitalism, the way I approach it is really grounded in what Reverend James Lawson called plantation capitalism. So Reverend Lawson being the leading theorist and strategist of nonviolence during the U.S. freedom movement. And he's based here in Los Angeles. And so a lot of the way that I think about racial and economic justice and just social justice is really grounded in that framework that Reverend Lawson always talks about plantation capitalism, that the economy in the U.S. is deeply embedded in the system of slavery and the oppression and exploitation of Black people, and that continues to today, right? So we operate within a system of plantation capitalism where you cannot extricate racism from class oppression, but the two are really intertwined, and the economic injustices of our system are really used to oppress and exploit people of color and to prevent true equity and justice. So it's kind of with that framing. And so Reverend Lawson, again, was working with Memphis sanitation workers during their strike in 1968. And so I want to kind of segue from that into the organizing that we see in Los Angeles, because I think a lot of the model of lawn organizing and worker organizing in Los Angeles is in many ways, I think, building on the legacy of the 1968 Memphis sanitation worker strike. And what I mean by that is that, Los Angeles is the second largest union dense city in the country, New York City being the first. And LA has one of the most vibrant labor movements in the nation, right? Labor unions, more social movement unions, as well as worker centers. And I think that is really grounded in building on this legacy of fighting racism while we're also fighting economic exploitation. And so just to maybe share some examples of that, if we look at the labor movement, again, I just want to draw on Reverend Lawson's teachings. He worked with Maria Elena Durazo and Unite Here Local 11 going back about, close to 30 years, I think, where she brought him in and asked him to introduce nonviolence to the union, right? And so hotel workers, primarily women of color, and have organized and built one of the most powerful labor unions and innovative labor unions in the country. If we look at Justice for Janitors, we look at the security officer organizing, SOLA, primarily African-American workers. All of that is really grounded in, I think, really building worker power and challenging plantation capitalism. There's also a constellation and a network of worker centers in Los Angeles as well. Actually, all of the worker centers in LA right now are led by women of color, including the LA Black Worker Center, which actually helped to lead to the founding of Black worker centers across the country and a Black worker center network. And so, there's this, I think, intertwining of fighting racism at the same time that we're fighting economic exploitation. And so that leads to my next point, which is around, what is the potential role of lawyers in fighting plantation capitalism? And I would posit that I think really our role as lawyers, as movement lawyers, is to support the organizing, right? That, I learned from the very first case I worked on, the Monte case I mentioned, from Julie Sue, that as lawyers, we are not the ones who should be leading and speaking out all the time. Rather, our role is to serve those who are most directly impacted and to support their leadership, their organizing, and really in a way that is grounded, that is ethical, and that is strategic and effective. So what are some of the ways that lawyers have done that? Again, I'll just speak about the LA example because that's my experience. So I would say that movement lawyers in LA, we work a lot with labor unions as well as with worker centers. And it's all about how can we, as partners, as allies, but always with the theory of social change that centers the primacy and the leadership of those who are directly impacted, be of service. So that can range from, education like Know Your Rights and doing workshops and providing services like with wage claims, for example, or anti-discrimination cases, to doing, litigation, impact litigation that can really further the strategic goals in a campaign. For example, Clean Car Wash Workers, the Clean Car Wash Worker Center, I'm on the board of Clean, and Clean has had organizing campaigns at several car washes where primarily Latinx workers make sub-minimum wages, and the strategic litigation has been really critical in furthering their organizing efforts. There's also policy advocacy. For example, the LA Black Worker Center right now, they just won a historic ordinance at the LA City level to enable the city to actually handle anti-discrimination cases and enforce anti-discrimination laws. And they're now advocating for SB 218 at the state level that would allow local jurisdictions to also handle discrimination claims so that it wouldn't just be at the state level. Right? So there's policy advocacy as well, and lawyers have provided technical assistance and legal research and analysis, things like that. So there's a range, and I would say that, really it's about how can lawyers support the leadership of those who are at the forefront of fighting plantation capitalism and who are most affected by plantation capitalism. And then finally, I'll just end with I think, I know that there have been longstanding issues of racism within unions as well, and that we continue to be challenged by that and to try to struggle against that. At the same time, I do just want to highlight that, if we look at the impact of unions for people of color, union members of color have almost 5 times more wealth than non-union members of color. So even with the imperfections of unions, I think there is just empirical evidence that union membership helps to build power for workers and to redistribute wealth. And I think there is a growing movement of social movement unions that really understand why race also has to be at the center of the struggle. For example, United Teachers of Los Angeles, they recently did a 6-day strike, right, in the rain, and they won. And one of their collective bargaining demands was actually to reduce random searches in schools, right, a racial justice issue. And they understood it as a racial justice issue, and they fought for it at the bargaining table. So I think with that, I'll just pause there, but just say that I think, the struggle, the nonviolent struggle against plantation capitalism continues. And I think as lawyers, we can really be in service of the movement, and especially those most directly impacted.
Great, thank you so much, Betty. And I just want to remind folks that we are going to have a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions at any point, just drop them into the chat. And then, Betty, just as a follow-up question, if you could give a piece of advice for lawyers on how they could practice anti-capitalism on their day-to-day work, what would that be?
I'm sorry, you want me to answer that now? Oh, okay. So I think a way to practice that day to day is really to center workers, right? And what I mean by that is that in our practice, to really humble ourselves and to recognize that the leadership, the life experiences of workers has to be central. If we think about organizing campaigns, oftentimes there is retaliation, and yet workers stand up and organize, right, in the struggle, and because of that, that leads to social change and more justice. And so there is, I think, an ethics and a morality around it, around really recognizing that as lawyers, we're not the ones who are taking the risks. And so to really humble ourselves, to always center the voices of workers. So what that could mean day to day, for example, is, if there's an opportunity to speak at an event, like the lawyers, we shouldn't be the ones talking, right? The workers should be telling their stories. Or let's say in a strategy meeting, lawyers should not be making decisions. It should be the directly impacted workers, right, who are making the decisions. And not just if they're the client, but just in an organizing campaign. And I think most importantly is to really just approach this in, I think, a way that's grounded in respect and really honoring the humanity of each and every person. And so that may sound kind of touchy-feely, but I have to say, like, that is really the way to build trust, to build real solidarity, and the kind of transformative relationships that are necessary for us to really withstand all the attacks that we face and will continue to face, and all the challenges, but it really starts with how we treat one another. And so really, I think leading with humility and compassion and love, and also fierce courage and conviction, and a willingness to give up our own privileges, especially that we be willing to give up our own privileges in the fight.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over to Vero. Vero, if you could also talk about your work and how this all fits into that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Good evening, y'all. My name is Vero Pao, and I want to address the question of what is to be done as lawyers and organizers in challenging capitalism. And through this answer, I'm going to discuss a little bit about my work. I'm also going to weave those answers through an analysis of contemporary racial capitalism. Because for me, I think any sort of meaningful engagement in my day-to-day anti-capitalist work has to start with an analysis of where we're at right now. And so I'm going to take in turn defining each of those three words, contemporary racial capitalism. So just as a review, I think Bill did a good job on racial capitalism. For me, the racial and racial capitalism, the racial signals an inherency within capitalism to appropriate and extend racializing logics to exploit and expropriate subjects under capitalism. I'm hearing a feedback. Is that okay?
I just want to remind folks, if you're not speaking, to please have yourself on mute.
Okay, so that's the racial qualifier to capitalism. Capitalism, I think Bill sufficiently defined, and I agree with. It's an economic system valuing profit over people. It has an expansive logic where capitalists are constantly trying to accumulate more profit, or else other capitalists will undercut them. What I want to focus on briefly is that the sustenance of the system of capitalism depends on the reproduction of the capitalist class relation. That is, a society divided into a class of those who own the means of production, the capitalists, and those who don't, the proletarians. So this reproduction of the class relation at every level of society, every level of consciousness. So as an example, workers depend on being paid just enough in wages by their employer to go home at night, and then to feed themselves and their family, and then go back to work the very next day, and the whole process starts again. You multiply that by a billion, billions of people on this planet, and we get capitalism self-sustaining itself. So I'm going to depart slightly from Betty insofar as in terms of supporting workplace organizing. Yes, absolutely. As movement lawyers, I think we should support workplace organizing. But in all honesty, the anti-capitalist side of me has a contradictory relationship to workplace organizing, because on the one hand, yes, we should support higher living wages, safer workplace conditions, and that, in the words of the Black Panther Party, is survival pending revolution. But let's not confuse that with the overcoming of capitalism, because by advocating for higher wages, we are in effect reifying the system of capitalism, because we are saying that workers should exist as workers and depend on being paid something in order to access commodities to self-reproduce themselves and their families. And so in contrast, the anti-capitalist sort of side of thinking and analysis and lawyering is, can we support existing grassroots alternatives that don't rely on reproducing this wage relation or dependency on traditional forms of finance, traditional forms of access to commodities in the workplace. And so I do want to return to a theme that Whitney raised earlier, and that is one of the things I do wholeheartedly support are urban community gardens. I think I live in Baltimore. It's there's a grassroots movement where these gardens are springing up to address a real crisis in food justice. There's food apartheid left and right in every single quadrant of this city. And what I like about this is it reconnects people to the land, which is a form of dispossession under capitalism, but it also allows people to produce their own sustenance without depending on money and such. And of course, not every form of institution or alternative in the so-called solidarity economy is a complete departure from capitalism. Sure, we live in a system where we have to engage with the reality of what does dual power look like? How do we use enough of the existing monetary exchange so that we can transition to a departure down the road? So that's one line of thinking I am constantly assessing. And then I want to also talk about the term contemporary racial capitalism. And I want to start this narrative in the 1970s where, globally, but I'll focus on the United States, deindustrialization occurred and the economy transitioned from industrial production to financialization. This is significant because under industrial production, workers are the source of value creation. In contrast, under financialization, capitalists themselves have no use for workers. They're a superfluous entity. Capitalists instead create new value or create the new appearance of value by investing existing wealth, repackaging it in the stock market, in speculative real estate bubbles and such. And the point I want to emphasize with this is that increasingly Americans are finding themselves rendered surplus to the employment needs of capitalists. In other words, yesterday's workers are today's debtors and incarcerated persons. And so just to briefly touch on mass incarceration, the prison boom rises at the time of deindustrialization because there's a function of prisons to warehouse the surplus population. And so I don't want to talk about abolition because I know there was a previous webinar on this, but the point is, I think absolutely abolition of prisons is an anti-capitalist struggle. We are trying to dismantle a key foundational pillar of contemporary capitalism with the abolition movement. But I'm going to transition and focus more on indebtedness because, again, Americans are finding themselves more and more no longer permanently employed. They are more precarious workers, classified as independent contractors or at-will non-unionized workers, or just sort of like Eric Gardner, involved in selling loosies in the informal economy. This is the reality for the vast majority of Americans today. And so, again, yesterday's workers are today's debtors in the sense that in order to reproduce themselves socially and their families, they must access credit, instead, because they're no longer being paid a consistent wage by an employer. And so this access of credit has taken on, under financialization, has taken on very predatory forms of lending, subprime loans, high interest rates, free floating rates that ultimately subject individuals into cycles of debt that are inescapable. And so I think as a movement anti-capitalist lawyer then and organizer, we should look at attack the big banks that make subprime loans, the student loan corporations, and also the smaller but more visible predatory lenders that are spatially located in low-income communities of color. So in my day-to-day work, I challenge the for-profit commercial bail bonds industry. They're spatially located right across from jails and right inside communities of color. I'm also talking about rent-to-own stores, payday lenders. These forms of visible private lenders is a focal point we can attack. And there's also an analog to municipal debt because increasingly under deindustrialization, municipalities themselves are getting financialized, right? Because when industrial production companies leave, the tax base leaves, and in turn, the white middle class leaves in a process we all know as white flight, right? And so municipalities are trying to balance the budgets off the remaining population, the low income people of color too poor to flee, right? And so this takes on the form, as we are increasingly aware of from the 2015 Department of Justice report on Ferguson, the fines and fee farming, the offender-funded justice systems, traffic court fines and fees. All these things are another source, municipal sources of debt that I think anti-capitalist organizers and movement lawyers should engage with in attacking. So I know my time is kind of coming up, but I want to summarize my points. There are defensive struggles to wage in the forms of attacking the forms of private and public sources of debt. And there are kind of aspirational goals that we should support, like abolition. And finally, there are creative grassroots alternatives which already exist that are trying to break from traditional forces, traditional sources of financing and indebtedness. And we should really seriously study and support, community land trusts, as was mentioned before, urban community gardens, and food cooperatives.
Great. Thank you so much, Beryl, for all of that information. Whitney, we're going to pass to you now.
Great. So yeah, I'm primarily going to focus on the work of Freedom Road, or formerly known as Freedom Road, Liberation Road, in terms of our national strategy and a couple of projects that are implementing that strategy. So one, I just want to say, in terms of the kind of relationship to and thinking about capitalism, it's just really important to highlight that capitalism is always in some form of crisis, both economically and as we've seen over decades now, also ecologically, because of its growth imperative. And that because of that, there's always these periods of crises around political legitimacy, where the kind of governing institutions that are put in place were never meant to kind of deeply or radically deal with the crises that pop up. They were only meant to kind of like manage the interests of the ruling class. So with that kind of like as background, if you will, the main enemy that we've named in this moment are the New Confederacy. And we define them as this kind of reactionary white united front that's made up of sectors of capital and kind of like middle strata white folks. And their political instrument is the Republican Party. And that through the structure of federalism, where like states as a geographic political unit have a lot of power, both in terms of organizing and setting conditions within the state, but also being able to organize up, right, and really impact kind of which sectors of capital and which social bases have the most kind of control of government at the national level. And so, yeah, through processes like gerrymandering, et cetera, the Republican Party, and again, the kind of new Confederate forces that are behind it, have really been able to capture a lot of power at the national level and move the agenda and therefore the response of the Democratic Party, which represents other sectors of capital. Don't get me wrong, but also other social bases to pull further to the right or become more reactionary in their response to a program. So the political program that we outlined for the New Confederacy is 3 pillars. So one is austerity. The second is a reactionary racial program that's centered in white supremacy. And the third is heteropatriarchy. Excuse me. And so in order to defeat the New Confederacy, Liberation Road identifies that we need to build a broad united front. And united front is both a kind of framework and a principle around having the broadest array of forces attacking the narrowest of enemies. And within that broad array of forces, right, there are people who are completely against the program of the enemy, of the identified enemy, so in this case, the New Confederacy, all the way to like the other end of the spectrum. So an example of those who are like in opposition to, like in complete opposition to the new Confederate program, you could think like, a lot of the, think Black Lives Matter, think Law for Black Lives, right? Like lots of different kind of movements and social justice organizations. And then the kind of middle forces that can be aligned on some issues with the new Confederacy, but not actively working against the kind of interests of the advanced forces. They tend to fall more silent. And then the kind of third sector of the United Front is what we call the backwards forces, that are made up of people who are both actively working against, like they have an interest in actively working against the certain aspects of the new Confederates plan, while also wanting to support, or at least appear to support, other aspects of the program that have to do with like the people's forces, if you will. So an example of that would be the leading coalition within the Democratic Party, which is like the kind of corporate wing, if you will. So we have projects primarily in the South that are focused on building political power. And the way that we define political power is the relative ability of an alliance to like fight for and get the organization of society in the face of competing alliance, and which is much broader than what tends to be thought of as political is only electoral. So yes, it includes the electoral arena. We think that's a key side of struggle, and political is about like engaging in other types of fights where contradictions come up or confrontation is had with other kind of enemy forces, if you will. So these, in the projects in the South, we've built what we call independent political organizations, or what are referred to as independent political organizations, where we are independent in every sense of the word, particularly from the Democratic Party. So recognizing that we can't beat the new Confederacy without them. That these independent organizations have their own funding sources, set their own agendas, have their own organizing models, etc. That on the one hand, when need to, they unite with the Democratic Party in a tactical way, towards getting certain wins or gains from the new Confederacy, and in some cases have to like fight against or confront the kind of the nastier sides, if you will, of the corporate Dems. So through these independent political organizations, we're building political power with what we refer to as a strategic alliance and some of its allies. The strategic alliance are oppressed nationality movements and multinational working class movements. And I want to stress that this is not, the strategic alliance isn't it's not a demographic category. So it is the politically active forces within kind of oppressed nationality demographics and within the multinational working class. And what building political power for us entails are four things. So one is creating a common identity that a broad set of constituencies can take up as their own. The second is having a deep mutual solidarity across constituencies and their issues. The third is breaking the alliance of the various constituencies and the allegiances they have with kind of the other political forces and their worldviews, and bringing them into a new worldview that is both more inclusive and responsive in nature. And then the fourth is creating a broad political program that at once kind of speaks to like each of the individual constituencies can identify their specific needs within the broader program. And I'll have to stop there because of time.
You actually have 4 more minutes if you want to keep going.
Well, don't tempt me with a good time, Kimberly. So I think the kind of next thing that I'll say is that these IPOs for short engage in what we call the inside outside. And by we, I mean just other kind of left and progressive forces call a inside outside strategy with the Democratic Party. And so that's kind of our aims when working inside, particularly what we've experienced in the South, has been like using the Democratic Party party line when it comes to like running our own candidates to get people elected. It has meant, in some cases, using the resources of the Democratic Party. So whether it be their voter databases or the money that they shell out for really important races, as long as there's like a Democratic Party candidate that they can kind of that they identify or just like acknowledge is on the Democratic Party line, which is a whole lot to talk about around the kind of lack of organization that we experience here in the South around the Democratic Party. And there's a whole lot to talk about in terms of understanding the nature of the Democratic Party and what it is and what it isn't. Both parties, actually, the Democratic and the Republican Party. But yeah, so I'm trying to think. Yeah, so anyways, our kind of outside strategies have looked like, engaging in, fights around like housing or kind of anti-state violence work when it comes to, what do you call it? Like restored rights for felons, like those types of things, restored voting rights for felons. So they're meant to be these flexible organizations that can that sees the electoral terrain, as a tool that can be used and leveraged towards helping to build political power of constituencies. And then the last thing that I'll say is in terms of our one of our aims when we're getting our folks elected into governing positions is to establish two different types of relationships. So one is having more spaces where constituencies actually engage with the elected official in a way where they're actually like building common program and policy together, which is different than the kind of model of let's get somebody elected and then like hold them accountable. So the holding accountable tends to turn into this antagonistic relationship where you feel like you're having to force this person to do something. And so we are looking more into like cooperative models of governing and what that looks like, recognizing that all of these things have limits given the realities of state power, which is, can't even get into that because there's no time. But then the second relationship that we kind of look to shift is having elected officials that can actually help organize other elected officials effectively towards kind of policies or programs that benefit the constituents. And that's actually time.
Thank you so much, Whitney, and to all of our panelists for engaging with us. So we're going to move into our Q&A portion. Reminder to please drop questions into the chat if you have them. And while we wait for people to put in their questions, we can start with Karen's that was put in earlier. And she asks, capitalism and US imperialism are integrally related. Can someone please talk about how to make these connections in organizing for socialism, racial, and economic justice? And whoever wants to take that can start.
I can go first. So one, I'm about to, because of time, I'm going to present a very kind of simplified response to your question, Karen. We think about that there are these three forms of power that are both distinct but also interrelated. So the first is political power. And again, that's what we are trying to build now like we think in this moment. The second is governing power. I also want to just note that these aren't necessarily steps that I'm presenting. They more have a cyclical nature, but again, because of time, it's just, can't really get into it. But the idea is that as you grow your political power, you're able to grow your ability, or the ability of an alliance of constituencies to actually take on more ownership and control of the various governing aspects of their lives. In that, again, those things are working in a cyclical nature, so that as you're growing your political power, you're growing your governing power. And as you're growing your governing power, you're growing your political power, and so on and so forth. And so the idea is that as you grow more and more governing power, because again, there are very real limits that we see based on the realities of like state power. And I'm talking about state as in like the big state, right? So it's like where you can begin to control the kind of levers of economics, where you have access to control over military and law enforcement, media, all of those types of things. So as you're growing your governing power, and all of this is happening in opposition to other people who are contesting for power in these various arenas or various forms, but you're able to get to the level of the state. And so once you have state power, then you can begin to reorganize society towards socialism. But we can't just, like tomorrow, we're not just going to have state power, again, because there are lots of other forces and interests that are constantly contesting for and have hegemony right now over the state and the rest of society. And so, yeah, that's the simplified, as simplified as I can make it, answer to your question, Karen, or one aspect of your question.
I'd like to also take a stab, the connection between capitalism and imperialism. As we earlier stated, I think collectively, all the panelists stated that there are a few trends within capitalism, or inherent tendencies. One is capitalism and its constant need to accumulate and expand. And the other, relatedly, is to make the productive process more and more efficient. And so, so there's an inevitability towards, I guess, the production becoming automated or mechanized. And in so doing, again, less and less workers are being permanently employed. And this results in, on the one hand, a crisis of overproduction, on the other hand, a crisis of underconsumption. And so with all these new goods that are not being able to be consumed by folks who are no longer employable, hence the underconsumption crisis, there are needs for new markets, both labor and consumer markets. And so imperialism directly feeds into the capitalist crisis of realization and the need to accumulate more and more, and to realize how those produced goods get sold in the marketplace. So I think that's a direct connection. And I think the implication for organizing then is, how can we think beyond our borders? And how can we connect with other workers at kind of central conduits throughout the global economy and struggle together? And, I don't necessarily have the answer to that, but I want to just throw it out there in terms of what the implications might be with capitalism and imperialism.
Thank you so much, Whitney and Vero. I'm gonna jump to the next question. I'm curious about folks' thoughts on the relationship between gender and capitalism. How do we make sure not to recreate heteropatriarchy in our vision or organizing? Also would love any reading suggestions the panelists or others might have.
There is no guarantee. One of the reasons that I am not an anarchist is that I believe that with the elimination of capitalism, there will still be the need for a while for a state, and a state to reorganize society, to take on issues like the environment, to tackle various forms of racist and national oppression, male supremacy, etc. So the only guarantee we have is a guarantee of struggle. And I don't mean that rhetorically, I mean that real. And the outcome of that struggle is not inevitable. In other words, there's no guarantee that we're going to win. The hands from the grave rise up through the ground and grab our ankles when we try to leave the graveyard. And they grip our ankles very tightly. And so attempts to break free of racism and national oppression, male supremacy, heteropatriarchy, all of those things are fighting against how deeply rooted this is in the system. And it's not simply a matter of who is running the government. It's, to borrow from Lenin, it's about force of habit. And you need a struggle that is organized at the level of the state to take that on, because the force of habit is in fact the hands from the grave.
Yeah, I want to double down on what Bill just raised, and even in thinking about the kind of relationships between gender and capitalism and how that shapes, how family is talked about or organized or privileged in some ways, depending on the kind of shape of it, or the kind of character of it, which leads into what Veryl had mentioned earlier around the kind of social reproduction and how that happens on a variety of levels. I also think it's prudent of us, as we all kind of continue to deepen our, consciousness, understanding, and like plans of attack, if you will, against these systems, that we also think about the role of the ableism and how that also gives shape to various economic and social hierarchies within capitalism. And so for the suggested readings, the one reading is Chantal Mouffe, and I'll put it in the chat, a Belgian political theorist who writes about far-left populism. And then another resource that's not a reading, but a podcast called The Dig. There's an episode called People's Power that critiques some of what Chantal Mouffe raises and talks more about the role of social movements in building populism. So yeah, those are the two kind of resources, materials that I would uplift.
Great, thank you so much. We have one last question. And Philip asks, or first he says, thank you to all the panelists for your insight and wisdom on transcending capitalism. How can socialists more vocally highlight the fact that racism and economic oppression are intrinsically linked under capitalism? I write this as a socialist who is a DSA member, who often hears the argument of economic equality made at the expense of negating the centrality of Black liberation and wider racial justice for all oppressed peoples of color in overarching discussions on class struggle.
I mean, see, fundamentally, with all due respect to DSA, DSA does not have a theory on race and racist oppression. And as a result, there's all kinds of varying and contending theories that float around DSA about the significance or lack thereof of race. The argument has to be made historically, and it needs to get beyond race as a matter of personal interactions, microaggressions, etc. All of those are manifestations of the nature of the system itself of racist oppression. So it's really important to engage people in those historical discussions. One of the things that I've been working on with the Washington State Labor Council, which is the state AFL-CIO, was the creation of a racial justice education project. And it begins with a historical analysis. It's not about, you taste my food, I'll taste yours, and we'll sing Kumbaya. It's not about why don't you all like each other. It really is about rooting our understanding of race in the construction of capitalism. And I would argue that's what needs to happen. There's no silver bullet on this. And it also means struggling against ideas that are articulated sometimes by very good people. One of the challenges that I've had with Bernie Sanders, even though I'm supporting Bernie Sanders, is that his view of race relates to what I was saying earlier, the notion of race as an add-on to capitalism. And that if we can identify overarching issues that unite us all, we can break the racial barrier. And that is a problematic view. We have to understand a few things. And one of the things that many white radicals actually can't come to grips with is that racism is actually contrary to the interests of white workers. See, if you believe that racism is basically, if you ignore history and you believe that racism is in the interest of white workers, it puts us in one hell of a pickle, because you basically are then simply only being able to appeal to people on the basis of morality. If you understand the nature of the racist system and the issue of social control, then you're in a position to make an argument to white workers about why it's in their interests to oppose racist oppression. And there's many historical examples of leftists that have taken that up. And that's why I go back to every organization needs a theory of race, the construction of race and its interrelationship with capitalism.
Okay, thank you so much, Bill. So we are out of time for today. I know there's a couple of questions that we didn't get into, but we're definitely committed to continuing to explore this conversation with you all. Just so that you know, we'll be posting the recording between tomorrow or the day after, so you can expect it online within a couple of days. And we'll make sure to link to all of the resources that our panelists have provided. Thank you all so much for joining us and for engaging, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Good night.